As the last part of this module on algorithmic bias, we'll discuss the topic related to algorithmic bias that probably has gotten the most attention in the media, which is facial recognition. In fact, if you looked at all topics related to data science, facial recognition has got to be near the top, if not at the top, of the topics that have gotten the most coverage. For this reason, choosing media articles to include in this lesson has been quite a challenge. There's so many of them, and they keep coming out. These articles also cover all the different aspects you could think of, the technical issues, the issues related to how facial recognition is applied, and policy and legal aspects. And of course, there's ethical issues that are related to all of those. So this lesson will be somewhat of a sampler. We're going to start out by giving a very brief overview of how facial recognition works from a technical point of view. Then secondly, talk about the algorithmic bias issues related to facial recognition, including a small sample of the issues that can arise from that algorithmic bias. Third, we'll turn to the policy and legal side and give just a very small sample of the myriad of different governmental approaches towards regulating facial recognition. And finally, interesting indication of how major tech companies are dealing with what their involvement with facial recognition should be. If there's ever a topic that is ripe for discussion and debate, this is it. And so we're going to do that as well as we can in this context by ending this lesson with a discussion board where you'll be encouraged to submit viewpoints and then debate viewpoints of your fellow students. First, the virtual background. The last one was in Hawaii, and I already told you where it is, so there's nothing more to discuss about that. For this one, we'll go back to guessing, although if anybody has been to this place, I suspect you'll recognize it fairly quickly. One thing I'll confirm is that later in this lesson, we'll be talking about policy issues in the European Union and other parts of Europe. And so I'll just state the obvious that this is a picture from somewhere in Europe. So now back to facial recognition. I think all of you are familiar with it and are familiar with some of its uses. One of the things that makes facial recognition so interesting is that there is such a diverse set of uses. So as examples, and this is just a sampling, it can be used for security, whether it's used for security of getting into your phone or getting into your house or getting into your place of work. It can be used for social media, for tagging photos in Facebook, which is something we're actually going to look at, or related things. It can be used in criminal processes, in trying to locate criminals. And it can be used in government surveillance for any number of reasons. Now, another thing that makes this not only interesting but challenging is that it may be that your opinion on whether these are legitimate and ethical uses or not depends on how accurate the facial recognition is. And there's some cases where it might be that if we knew that they were foolproof, we would feel one way about it. And if we know that they have high error rates, that we'll feel another way. And there may also be some cases where that doesn't matter, where no matter how accurate the facial recognition is, there are ethical concerns about its use. So those comments motivate the things that we'll be discussing. So first, it's good to have just a rudimentary understanding of how facial recognition works. The first article in the reading list gives a very high level and simple but useful overview of that. I'll summarize this in what is probably one of the more rudimentary discussions of facial recognition that's ever been given, with the disclaimer that, like a lot of these topics, I'm certainly not an expert in it. At the highest level, what you've got is a process that goes from images of faces taken by cameras or things like them to numerical data, to analysis that's done on that numerical data, and then to conclusions that can be made based on that analysis. So from the images of faces, as the article describes, one extracts a decent number of measurements and possibly other data. These are measurements of various characteristics of the face, They can also include things that aren't just lengths or measurements, such as particular distinguishing marks on the faces. And there's more sophistication than simply measuring. There can be normalization for things such as the lighting or the orientation. If, for instance, if I turn my face in one direction or another, the measurements would be different, and you have to adjust for that. And the article also says that just this part of the process alone has improved hugely over the years and decades, and that's part of what's responsible for the advances in facial recognition. So what results from that is a large database of numerical or other data related to faces. And then the analysis phase tries to say from that data which ones correspond to the same faces and which ones do not. And that can be done in a variety of ways as well. Some of them are straight numerical. You're essentially, if you think of it simply, comparing two vectors to say, are they roughly the same or not? It's not quite as simplistic as that. There's plenty of techniques such as principal component analysis that can be used at that point. Or it can be done by machine learning, where the training data says these sets of data represent the same faces, these do not, and the algorithm tries to learn which sets in the future will represent the same faces and which have not. So that's a very high overview of it. As I said, it's become a pretty good process if it's used properly. And as a final comment, besides the analysis techniques, what has made this possible is simply having the data, having huge databases of faces, and that comes from the advances in computer vision and the much greater deployment of cameras around our population than we had before. The latter, of course, that deployment of cameras is an issue of some controversy itself, and it's something we're going to be talking about later in this unit. Now let's start talking about the algorithmic bias issues related to facial recognition. We'll start with the issue that you already heard about in Joy Buolamwini's TED Talk, the New York Times article that says that facial recognition only works if you're a white male. That may be a bit of a newspaper headline. It gets attention, and the reality is a bit more nuanced than that, as we'll discuss in a moment, but not all that much. So the article written in 2018 is based on the study by Buolamwini and Gebru, where they looked at the ability of facial recognition software to identify populations in general. This particular study, which was a landmark one at the time, the first one, as far as I know, that was done like this, looked at only 3 particular pieces of software, one from Microsoft, one from IBM, and one from a company in China. And the things that it found are so startling, in my opinion, that I'm going to have them go on the screen here as I say them. The software misidentified the gender of light-skinned men about 1% of the time. It misidentified the gender of light-skinned women about 7% of the time. It misidentified the gender of dark-skinned men about 12% of the time. And it misidentified the gender of dark-skinned women about 35% of the time, a range from 1 to 35. Why? Nothing special. I mean, nothing surprising, totally tied to the training data. It had not been trained sufficiently on the populations that it had more problems with. Well, you almost look at that and say, how could that have been? How could people not have realized that? And you can also look at that and say, well, maybe those were the early days and things will get so much better. And indeed, the article contains comments from Microsoft and IBM. As you would expect, they say their software has gotten better. But 2 things. First, it clearly illustrates how software like this can have biases. And even if people get by this problem, there are certainly other problems that can arise. And secondly, it hasn't gotten that much better in the little bit of time that has elapsed since then. So there's an optional reading article on your list, also from the New York Times, written in December of 2019, that reports on a much more comprehensive study, a study by the US National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, that looked at 189 commercially available facial recognition software systems from 99 different developers, and among one of many conclusions, said that in the aggregate, those systems misidentified African American and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more frequently than Caucasian faces. In addition, they also had more trouble identifying women than men, and more trouble identifying older adults than middle-aged adults. So, although these are all problems that you think should be solvable through better data science and machine learning methodology, and probably in the long term they are, you also see that A, they haven't been solved yet, or at least they haven't made their way fully into commercial software yet. And you get the idea that these problems are probably going to persist for quite a while. And the consequences of facial recognition errors can be devastating to individuals in some circumstances. The second optional reading, which is also from the New York Times, talks about the false arrest of a Black man in Detroit, Michigan, based on facial recognition software. The article says that this may be the first instance where this has occurred, although it's probably just the first instance that's been publicized. We don't know that. The article also makes it clear that the facial recognition did not say that the person who was arrested, and was actually not the right person, was declared a match to the image of the criminal suspect by the facial recognition software. It wasn't. It was just somebody who was listed as a possible match. But the police still arrested the person, held that person overnight, and this had really profound and lasting consequences for that individual and for that man's family. So there may be questions about whether the police work was done the way it should have been, as well as the facial recognition quality itself. But issues such as this have led to many discussions in municipalities and nations about whether facial recognition should be used in police work. We already saw an article in our last lesson about Santa Cruz, California, and I haven't included more just for lack of time, but if you look online, you can find other municipalities, for instance, in the United States, both San Francisco, California, and Boston, Massachusetts, that have implemented policies against using facial recognition in police work. Now, whether this will change as facial recognition quality improves, whether we would use it if we knew that it had very close to 100% certainty, is something that we'll see as time goes on, and it is one of those deep ethical discussions related to facial recognition. The issues related to the uses of facial recognition go far beyond cases with police work or governmental uses. The second article that I asked you to read about relation or issues related to algorithmic bias and facial recognition is about the use by Facebook, in particular to tag photos, tag people in photos that people post on Facebook. If any of you use Facebook, and I assume a number of you do, you'll be familiar with this. This is the tag suggestion feature for photos, which apparently was launched quite a while ago in 2011. And as Facebook says, it was launched on an opt-in basis. So this is the feature where if somebody goes and posts a picture, often these are pictures of groups of people, that person will sometimes label who a person is. But if that person is on Facebook themselves and are in therefore in a database that Facebook has, Facebook may also post a tag suggestion saying, we think that person is so-and-so. So a court in the US state of Illinois determined essentially that using that is an invasion of privacy. And in fact, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is something that protects personal rights, made a statement, quite a strong one, which I'll read to you. It says, "This decision," they're referring to the Illinois decision, "is a strong recognition of the dangers of unfettered use of face surveillance technology. The capability to instantaneously identify and track people based on their faces raises chilling potential for privacy violations at an unprecedented scale." So, strong words. Facebook said, I'm not sure if it was in direct response, but we quote, "We have always disclosed our use of face recognition technology, and then people can turn it on or off at any time." So I'm just teeing this up as one of the issues that you might like to discuss in the discussion boards, particularly if this is something you've used or experienced yourselves. Where do you think this is on the spectrum? I'll give you 3 points that you could come in on. One of them is, well, if you sign up for Facebook, this is part of the deal. You should just accept it. The second one is, well, if you sign up for Facebook, you should have the ability to opt in or out. But if you opt in, then it's okay. And the third one should be, it should simply not be allowed because, and you can fill in the blanks there, but it can lead to bad things such as stalking, as an example, even if the person thought it was okay. So I'm just queuing that up, as I said, and it may be one of the discussions that you would like to have at the end of this lesson.